Welcome, Country Joe McDonald, to the Bay Area in Portsmouth, as opposed to San Francisco. Just about a week ago, you were playing across at the Isle of Wight, yeah? And the great thing for your fans is that you've brought together the classic Country Joe lineup. Can you tell us how that came to be?
Well, it's a difficult story to say how it came to be. There's no simple explanation for it, except that ever since the breakup of what you might call the classic lineup of Country Joe and the Fish, there's been a lot of people. I've wanted to get the band back together, but for one reason or another, it hasn't been possible. And the last 10 years, I tried very hard to get the five of us back together. There's four of us together here and now touring. And Barry Melton, the guitar player, there was complications about him getting with the band. A whole variety of complications.
I notice you're called the Country Joe Band.
Right.
And not Country Joe and the Fish.
No, Barry Melton is Barry the Fish Melton. And so if he was included in the lineup, we could call it Country Joe and the Fish. But I won't go into the complications. One of them being that he's very busy as a solicitor, as a lawyer,
Right.
and he doesn't have a flexible schedule. So, anyway, recently I was nominated for an award in Hanoi. It's called World Music Peace Awards, and that gave me an excuse to call around and see who wanted to get together and who didn't want to get together and that thing. And one thing led to another, and we finally agreed on something and got together and we're performing.
So it's David, Chicken and Bruce.
And me, yes.
Yeah. And when it came to choosing the repertoire that you're going to be playing on this tour, that you have been playing, did you decide to focus on one particular era or different ones?
Well, I really wanted to hear my compositions played once again by the original players who played the compositions then, because I've tried over the years to get other people to play them, and the music never sounded right.
Yeah.
And so I didn't know it was an abstract concept, because David lives in New York City and Gary Chicken, he lives in Oregon, and so we weren't in one location. So I had to make an agreement amongst each other about the financial, legal arrangement, and book a tour, which we did of just a month and a half ago, of the West Coast. Had to book the tour as a vehicle to get together. See, and then when we got together, there was a lot of abstract ideas I had about what we would do and what would happen, but then when we got together, the thing that was obvious was that the magic of us playing together on those original tunes was what's going to be very, very special. And then when we got in front of audiences, it was apparent that they wanted to hear also that original sound, and so it's only been 2 months now, and so that's where we are now. We're not a static band, we haven't been, but so we will move on to some other things.
And trying new material as well, yeah?
We hope to have new material and to make a new recording with new material. And then there's I personally have a lot of material from the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, which we can draw upon.
And the other three guys, they've been very busy in the meanwhile. Chicken, he's jazz drummer in Oregon, isn't he?
Chicken has been playing jazz in Oregon and not traveling. He's not traveled almost not at all until now, in between the times. David Bennett Cohen and myself have played together quite a lot over the past few decades, sometimes as a duo. And Bruce Barthol I've seen and I've played with occasionally too.
And David has played in a lot of blues bands over the years as well, isn't he? That's very much.
He's played in
important.
blues bands, and he gives guitar lessons and piano lessons, and he's made videos about that. He's played a wide variety of music.
And Bruce, what's his solo aspect?
Well, he's been playing bass, and as a matter of fact, in a band that he was in 20 years ago, they were my backup band. They were called Energy Crisis, and he's been in a couple bands that I've had over the years. But he's been his mainstay has been that as a musical writer for the San Francisco Meme Troupe,
Right.
which puts on political plays in the park in San Francisco. He's done that for 28 years.
Is that the same mime group as going back to the Bill Graham and those days?
That is correct.
Right, right. And now that if we can go back to the very beginning of the Country Joe McDonald story, you were born into a political family.
That's correct.
And very much in those days, in the 50s, apparently your father, he was a card carrier, and there was a lot of activity around him, and you saw a lot of prejudice, right-wing prejudice. Would that be right?
That is correct. Yes.
And was that the thing? When did you decide you wanted to write songs and go ahead and take it that way? Was it your childhood experiences?
Well, it's a wide variety of experiences. I had my first rock band and wrote my first rock songs when I was 15 and 16 years old in high school. And I also played jazz on the trombone in dance bands and Dixieland jazz. I grew up with a wide variety of music in the household. Woody Guthrie music and Pete Seeger music, and union songs, we would call them. They were about the unions and that sort of thing. And also Gilbert and Sullivan. A lot of Gilbert and Sullivan in my household. But I also listened to Blind Lemon Jefferson and J.J. Johnson and cool jazz and swing and rhythm, a lot of rhythm and blues. And I've always had an eclectic taste. I didn't really start writing protest political music until I'd gotten out of the United States Navy and I was going to college, and there was this, folk boom of Tom Paxton and Phil Oakes and Ewan McCall, and it became quite fashionable and popular within a small segment of this.
This was the San Francisco coffee house scene, yeah?
Well, I wasn't really a part of that, but within the left-wing liberal establishment movement in England and in the United States, there became an awareness almost at the same time of the child ballads, of broadsides, and of people using folk and working class music as a vehicle for political thought and that sort of thing.
But the first song you wrote was I've Seen a Rocket, is that right?
Well, that's in high school, yeah. I did. That was my first, that was really my first political. It was a song that I had written about, it was a kind of Elvis Presley type song in the style and the delivery. And it had a punchline where it said, the Martian comes down from outer space and touches me on the shoulder out of its spaceship and says, "Tag, you're it." That was the comic punchline. And a friend of mine was running for office in high school, and so I changed the lyric to say, "Andy Haas for president." I changed it into a campaign song and he won. And I thought,
So it was
wow,
a lucky
this is.
song.
Well, I thought this is interesting. The power of music to affect some political action. But I didn't really start doing it until '63, when I saw Bob Dylan perform with Joan Baez, and I heard some of this new protest music, and I thought, well, I can do this, and I did it.
Your experiences, your 3 years in the Navy, were there songwriting inspirations there?
During that time, I did a pretty eclectic folk bag of music. I learned Japanese folk songs and a bit of Japanese culture and language, and I added it to my song bag of tricks. I didn't have any political, much of anything going on during that time.
What did you think to military life?
Oh, I didn't mind it. We were, particularly when my father was investigated, we moved down the economic scale quite a bit, and we did. I'd always grown up with working class pride, and hard work was a big thing in my family. You know, don't be proud that you're working class and a worker among workers. And so I wasn't overworked in the Navy. The food was good. I didn't have to worry about what I wore, and I wasn't fighting a war. And I got to travel to another country, and I had a pretty good time. Towards the end of the enlistment, I was bored and wanted to get out.
And how did you get out?
Oh, my enlistment ran out.
Oh, right,
Yeah.
right. And that experience, because ever since then, one of your main causes has been veterans especially from the Vietnam War. Did your Navy experience, obviously that must have made you sympathetic to the lot of a military man, yes?
Absolutely. I understand what it's like to be in the military. And I also understood that if I was ordered to kill in war, I probably would have done it. Yeah.
Right. And if we can just jump ahead to about 1970, when you went on that review with Donald Sutherland and Jane Fonda, am I right in thinking that you left that because you thought that neither Donald nor Jane Fonda, they had a real idea of what military life was about?
Well, Donald is the only person on the FTA show that had any military experience was myself, but Jane Fonda had what I would call an elitist attitude towards the working class soldiers that I didn't like. They felt they needed to dumb down the message and not be too sophisticated and complicated. And one specific conversation I had with Jane about they didn't even know how to read, you know, and spell, and spelling's always been a hard thing for me. So I identified very strongly with them, and I thought, well, you know, she was, I don't know about Donald, but Jane was in particular infatuated with radical politics. I wasn't infatuated with radical politics. I grew up with it.
Right.
And being Jewish, being a child victim of the Cold War, being ex-military, I knew very well how your life could be ruined by the system. And I wanted to avoid getting captured at all costs,
right.
especially in some kind of adventurism by a movie star. And so I'm out of here.
So it was glamorous politics on her part, yeah.
Well, she had she was having an adventure.
Right.
You know, and I've always been I do what I can to further the work of progress of the lower classes and the working people and to a better life. You know, you can call it revolution, but it's not revolution with a gun in your hand or anything. You know.
But another lifelong fascination, interest with you has been Florence Nightingale. That's also to do with the Crimean War, and I understand that you continue to research her life and are fascinated by those lives and the times.
Well, I got interested in Florence Nightingale. It's not been a lifetime. I got interested because of Linda Van de Vanter, a Vietnam War nurse who wrote her book Home Before Morning, and I heard her speak, and she challenged us as men to acknowledge women in war. And that was 1981, and that was the beginning of my adventure. I discovered that Florence Nightingale suffered from a nervous disorder as a result of her service in the Crimean War, and I suspected that it was post-traumatic stress disorder or post-traumatic stress syndrome, similar to what modern soldiers suffer, and that she was the first. And I began to research her life. I just did some more research in Derbyshire, in the public library on this trip, and I have a website. I tend to be an overachiever, and I just get into something. It's been a wonderful adventure, almost 25 years of studying her life, and I have a website which lots of school children visit who are doing projects on famous women, and I just happen to be fascinated with her.
Equally fascinating for me was in the 70s, the Vietnam vets, when they returned back to America, many of them were either sort of almost ridiculed, mocked, or pushed to one side. How do you explain that kind of reaction from Americans?
Well, it's very hard for civilians to understand the military experience. And people tend to, if you buy a car and the steering breaks down, you tend to think, well, the guy that made this car, made a, you know, made a crummy car, and it's kind of a system. So when you have a war, I think England's participation in the Iraq War is kind of interesting now, because I bring up the subject up to the audience, and they seem to kind of like they're puzzled. They're a bit puzzled, like, well, why would anybody be in the army in the first place, And so Americans, they wanted to either blame the soldiers for what happened in the war, the bad things, or credit them for the good things that happened. It's just the way what happens. It's the mystification of being a soldier. But I tend to see soldiers as workers. They're just workers, like iron workers or auto factory workers.
Yeah.
They have very little rights, and they're kicked around by the government, by the civilians, by the populace. You're not really. If they're not spitting on you, they're giving you a lukewarm glass of beer, really. So it's a cheap metal.
Yeah.
It's not really. No one joins the military, to get rich.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of money in it,
What do you think to films like The Deer Hunter?
I don't watch those things. I don't like fiction very much, I'm very interested in non-fiction. Very interested in that.
Reality.
I find reality very entertaining and fascinating. Yeah, really.
Getting back to the early 60s.
Reality, that's good. Yeah.
Getting back to the
Never thought of it that way. I said non-fiction. Yeah, reality, yeah. Odd from a person who took so many psychedelic drugs, but...
Well, let's get back to that, if we may. Let's get back to that. 1963, when you'd come out of the Navy, the first thing that you did was become an editor of a kind of underground press, Rag Baby.
Well, I made it up myself. It was called Etu at first.
Right.
A little zine. The kids would call it a zine now.
Right. Yeah.
Staple,
Yeah. Yeah. And then that was still you were a student in Los Angeles, but then moved to San Francisco.
Mm-hmm.
Am I right in thinking there was a massive cultural gap between San Francisco and Los Angeles in those early 60s on a musical scale?
It's a style gap. San Francisco tends to be a lot richer, have more money, and old traditional intellectual, whereas Southern California is very kind of middle class and casual. But the countercultural phenomenon of protest and everything was growing in both locations, all over the West Coast. So you could find the same music and the same attitudes, the same dress. There wasn't any beatniks left, really.
Right. And why did you move to San Francisco then?
Well, I wanted to be a beatnik. That's why I moved. Because in the Navy, we got really old magazines, and so I was behind the times. I'd been 3 years in the Navy, and I just thought, well, I'll go up to San Francisco with my wife, and I literally thought that I would play the guitar for a woman in a leotard dancing around, like the Pfeiffer cartoons, and somebody would play the bongo drums. Yeah, that's what I thought, in a coffee house.
Right.
Because I'd played a couple coffee houses around before I went in the Navy with another little group I had.
Right. And the instant action jug band, that started around the Vietnam teach-in, didn't it, in October 65? Is that about right?
Well, it started in 65. The exact moment and people is unclear.
13 strong, wasn't it? It was 13 strong at it. It was a huge band.
Well, it was an ad hoc thing. Whoever happened to be there, it had a moving membership. So that's why it was called the instant action, because on an instant it would play. It was kind of a panhandling, skiffle, busking, demonstration, whatever. You have to understand that when I went to Berkeley, there was one hippie in town.
Who was that?
Charlie Brown Artman. He played the auto harp and he lived in a teepee. And everybody else was really, well, about as hippie looking as I am now.
There was a vogue with bands like the Charlatans for sort of the 19th century Victoriana Wild West kind of style of clothing.
Yeah, but we didn't know anything. We were in Berkeley. We didn't know anything about that at all. I didn't know anything about that.
Right.
It was students.
And when did you decide that with, as well as Rag Baby being a zine, that it could be a record company, because you brought out 3 EPs on Rag Baby?
Oh, well, in October of '65, we had forgotten to get any copy for our upcoming issue of the magazine.
Right.
And we realized that at deadline that we had no copy. So that we had no articles, we had no schedules of the coffee shops, we had nothing, no adverts, we had nothing. And so I thought, wow, let's have a talking issue of the magazine. We'll record some songs and put it on an EP, and we'll call it a talking issue. And that's exactly what we did. That was Rag Baby. Rag Baby magazine morphed into Rag Baby Records, and we called it number 1. I don't know why, and we invented the name Country Joe and the Fish for that.
That's when you recruited Barry to sort of play with you,
yeah? Yeah. I had met Barry at the folk festival on the University of California campus, and we were playing together, and I said, let's go record this thing. And we got some other people who were part of the skiffle band, jug band thing, and just did it.
And you did the Fix Into Diarag and Superbird, is that right?
Yep.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
And then from that, how did it start slowly? Because 1965, around that time, there was the whole debate about acoustic instruments or electric instruments, and the 1965 Newport Folk Festival. There was all kinds of stuff going on.
Right. It was Bob Dylan's fault, completely. He went electric, we went electric. It's just like that.
As simple as that?
As simple as that.
And can you understand?
I think it was Highway 61 Revisited, right?
Right, yeah.
We heard that, we went and rented an amplifier. But we'd already rented an amplifier for the Superbird on the first EP. So it was acoustic instruments and an amplifier.
Right.
So we were transitioning. We were briefly folk rock. We were folk rock, and then rock. But that was pretty much what everybody else was doing anyway.
Right. But can you understand that Newport Folk Festival, Pete Seeger, apparently when he heard...
No, Pete Seeger, and I know Pete Seeger, and he's told me that he was mad because the PA system wasn't clear enough so you could hear Bob's voice.
Oh, I see.
And that's what he was arguing about.
Right.
I don't know what, there were other people who were doing other things, but that's what Pete was upset about, was that he wanted Bob's lyrics to be heard, because he always liked Bob.
So he didn't have any objections to electric?
No.
Oh, that's good to hear, because I heard a story that he'd come from a log cutting exhibition and he was going to go on stage and cut the wires because it was electric music.
No, that's rubbish, as you would say.
It's been on television. But
well, yeah. I mean, you know, you
Paul Rothschild.
You can hear disinformation from prime ministers and presidents, you know.
Right. It was a good
Even
story.
from Paul Rothschild. You
yeah,
can hear
it's a good story. Shame it isn't true.
Yeah, a good lie lives on for a long time.
And in '66, you got the deal with Vanguard Records and Sam Charters, the blues historian.
Right.
How did that come about?
It's another incredibly simple thing, because Charters and Ed Denson, who was managing us, who had Tacoma Records, they kind of knew each other from this folk world. And Charters was sleeping on Ed Denson's floor for some reason, because he didn't want to pay hotel, I guess. And he'd come to see the Charlatans and he didn't like them. And he said, by the way, aren't you managing some group? And Ed said, yeah. And he said, well, let me listen to him. And then we played some song that had kind of a folk riff in it, and he recognized that, and he thought, wow, okay, we'll sign these guys up. And then we just signed the contract.
And the transition from folk to psychedelia, Joe, can you tell me how that came about, your first acid experience, or first acid experience related to music?
Well, we just added, the band just played my compositions on electric instruments. We got those electric instruments just because we got those electric instruments. Bruce decided to play the bass because we didn't have a bass. We got a keyboard, I don't know why. David decided to try to play keyboard. And most people consider Section 43, the instrumental, to be one of the most definitive, I guess, top 10 psychedelic songs ever, acid songs ever composed in the world. And I hadn't had any marijuana or LSD when I composed that song. So it's not psychedelic influenced in any way. So when you take the repertoire of the first two albums of Country Joe and the Fish, it has the reputation of being very drug influenced, but which ones specifically and which ones not and whatever, I don't know. I mean, I probably would have written those songs the same way anyway, you know. But it is the kind of music that fit in very well to the psychedelic music era.
Right. And when did you first experiment with LSD?
Well, that would be late '66. Yeah.
And was it straight away a kind of buzz to create more music, or for it to inform your music, or was it just a much more introspective thing?
Well, it was, aside from getting high, it's hard for me to say exactly what happened. You know, it's not like drinking a couple beers, so it cries out for definition. But I wouldn't say that it influenced my music, because I was into John Cage and classical music and jazz before, and I had a widely divergent sense of composition. I was supposed to go into symphonic music actually at one point. So, and I mixed that with folk music. I mixed it all together, you know. It influenced the lyric because some of my lyric at that time was about drug references.
Right.
But I don't think that it made me a better musician, or I can't remember one instance in which I took a drug and at that moment wrote the composition, you know,
Right.
influenced by the drug experience.
Yeah.
Because generally I was just, you know, getting high. And usually if I write anything down, it you know, kind of, it didn't make any sense after it was over with.
Right.
Or I couldn't remember it.
Yeah. Yeah. And when you played the 1967 Monterey Pop Festival, I had to dig out this quote where you were very anti-commercial at that time, and you said that pop festival represented ethically, commercially, the complete opposite of what you all believed in. Now, can you tell me a bit more about your views at that time as to commercial music and things?
Oh, well, what I meant about that experience was, and history has proved me right, was that John Phillips and the Mamas and Papas used the vehicle of the Monterey Pop Festival and this West Coast Aquarian music scene to further a cause that they wanted to benefit, which was some kind of medical clinic or something, which never got the money. It's never been documented. And they closed the show out, and they were the stars of the show. So I felt that we were being used by is it Lou Adler, I think, and the Mamas and Papas,
Yeah.
who were, I mean, when you think of the Mamas and Papas, do you think of sociological, political music? No. And we definitely felt in the Bay Area that we were part of a social changing scene of new morals and a new way of lifestyle, which was anti-establishment, and it was anti-establishment.
What were you hoping to achieve? What was the main aim? To stop war?
Well, you know, the impetus, in my opinion, the impetus for the whole 60s thing was for us to have a better time than we had been having, to do our own thing, because we were up against a music that we didn't like, a way of dressing and acting that we didn't like, and we created, as we went along, a new alternate style, and along with it, the possibility that you could do something different, in spite of the fact that the establishment wanted you to not do what you were doing. And part of that was protesting, but part of it was just doing your own thing, you know.
Freedom.
A freedom to do your own thing, that's right.
And now going on to the classic platform, Woodstock 1969. What are your memories of that moment when you led 500,000 people for the Fish Cheer?
Well, you know, when they responded to the Fish Cheer, I was startled. I was stunned, because I had been playing for about 25 minutes before, and they hadn't paid any attention to me at all. So that was the thing, you know.
My goodness, so you just happened to be there on your own. Your band was going to play later, and Richie
Well, they were going to
Havens-
play another day. They were going to play on
Richie
Sunday.
Havens had just finished his set, and
Right, I just came early to watch the show.
and for 25 minutes they weren't listening.
They paid as much attention to me as these kids over here on this pier are paying attention to me. I remember it distinctly, and I've seen the outtakes. The audience is talking to each other and you know, doing all those things. You know, they had no interest in me whatsoever. And I walked off stage and I asked my colleague Bill Belmont, who was part of the staff, he was on stage. I said, what if I was saving this for the band set on Sunday. What if I do the cheer and Fixing a Dire Rag? What do you think it'll be okay? And he said, well, no one's paying any attention to you anyway. It doesn't make any difference what you do. We're just fill in time, because there's no one else to go on. Just keep on doing something.
Yeah.
And so I went, well, okay, you know. I walked back out on stage, and I was feeling pretty brave by then, because no one was paying any attention to me.
Yeah.
And I yelled, "Give me an F!" And they all stopped talking and turned and stared and yelled F. And I thought, oh.
Here I go.
Yeah, it's too late to stop now. And then I started haranguing them to sing louder, because I couldn't hear them because it was outside. The sound was going up in the air, you know.
Yeah.
They were all singing along. I couldn't believe it, you know. They knew the words to the song and everything. Then they stood up and they were cheering. And
A moment of history was created like that.
yeah, just like that, right.
Amazing.
They'd all heard the song before, you know. I didn't know that. And it turned out it was played a lot in New York, in the New York State, and they sang along. And
Why did you decide to leave the band?
oh, the band started falling apart. Everybody in the band has a different story. One by one, people were fired, arguments started. By the time the band dissolved, the Country Down the Fish band, there was only Barry Melton and myself left. It wasn't fun anymore. I missed the original members, although I'd been responsible for firing them, so I'm told. And we crashed and burned.
And did you enjoy your solo escapades during the 70s? You did film track soundtracks and solo albums. Did you enjoy that as much?
Well, it had moments of enjoyment, and it was rewarding, and I made some nice albums and some nice compositions, and I got to know quite a few different musicians. I played with them. I traveled a lot, but it was a lonely experience.
Right. What was the 1990 Superstitious album with Jerry Garcia? How did that come together?
Well, Jerry just agreed, because of Bill Belmont again, who knew him, to come and play some songs with so it was a couple days in the studio in which he played, and that was a lot of fun. I liked that.
Were the Grateful Dead an influence on you during the 60s?
Well, Jerry was. I used to stand at the bottom of the stage and I would watch his guitar playing style. And I liked Jerry. I didn't in general like the band, the Grateful Dead, that much. I didn't dislike them, but I liked Jerry's. Jerry had something I really liked.
And that had the number "The Lady with the Lamp," that album, yes, that was
Right.
which is your ongoing fascination with Florence Nightingale.
Right.
And what of the future?
The future?
Yes.
Well, I'm hoping that this Country Joe band will stay together and be a band. I want to experience, in my middling years, I want to experience being a rock band again. And I think that's happening with us. We're the band that you're going to capture today is very much a rock band. We've developed that bonding again and that communication on stage and musically that's a very special. I'm very lucky to be able to make a living in this profession, which I heard a basketball player describe his profession once as making a living in a children's game. You know, and rock and roll music is really a children's thing. We were children then, and we're very lucky to be able to do that. It has its ups and its downs of the road and the grind of it, but it's the envy of an enormous part of the population that they would love to be what we are, and we're really loving that aspect of it too. To be in our late 50s, in our 60s, playing psychedelic rock and roll music, and doing it really well, and having people really liking it. It's a blessing and a gift. It's a gift.
Joe, thank you very much for your time.
You're welcome.